Alright, 3C, let's keep going. We're at the bottom of page 65. In the autumn, by a tremendous, exhausting effort, for the harvest had to be gathered at almost the same time, the windmill was finished. The machinery had still to be installed, and Whymper was negotiating the purchase of it, but the structure was completed. In the teeth of every difficulty, in spite of inexperience, of primitive implements, of bad luck, and of Snowball's treachery, the work had been finished punctually to the very day. Tired out but proud, the animals walked round and round their masterpiece, which appeared even more beautiful in their eyes than when they had built it the first time. Moreover, the walls were twice as thick as before. Nothing short of explosives would lay them low this time. And when they thought of how they had laboured, what discouragements they had overcome, and the enormous difference that would be made in their lives when the sails were turning and the dynamos running, when they thought of all this, their tiredness forsook them, and they gambolled around and round the windmill, uttering cries of triumph. Forsook means to leave. Napoleon himself, attended by his dogs and his cockerel, came down to inspect the completed work. He personally congratulated the animals on their achievement, and announced that the mill would be named Napoleon Mill. Of course. 2 days later, the animals were called together for a special meeting in the barn. They were struck dumb with surprise when Napoleon announced that he had sold the pile of timber to Frederick. Tomorrow, Frederick's wagons would arrive and begin carting it away. That's weird. You remember on the previous page, they'd been told that, the new slogan was Death to Frederick, so this is a strange turn of events. Throughout the whole period of his seeming friendship with Pilkington, Napoleon had been in secret agreement with Frederick. All relations with Foxwood had been broken off. Insulting messages had been sent to Pilkington. The pigeons had been told to avoid Pinchfield Farm and to alter their slogan from Death to Frederick to Death to Pilkington. At the same time, Napoleon assured the animals that the stories of an impending attack on Animal Farm were completely untrue, and that the tales about Frederick's cruelty to his own animals had been greatly exaggerated. All these rumours had probably originated with Snowball and his agents. It now appeared that Snowball was not after all hiding on Pinchfield Farm, and in fact had never been there in his life. He was living, in considerable luxury, so it was said, at Foxwood, and it had in reality been a prisoner of Pilkington for years past. The pigs were in ecstasies over Napoleon's cunning. By seeming to be friendly with Pilkington, he had forced Frederick to raise his price by £12. But the superior quality of Napoleon's mind, said Squealer, was shown in the fact that he trusted nobody, not even Frederick. Frederick had wanted to pay for the timber with something called a cheque, which it seemed was a piece of paper with a promise to pay written upon it. But Napoleon was too clever for him. He demanded payment in real £5 notes, which were to be handed over before the timber was removed. Already Frederick had paid up, and the sum he had paid was just enough to buy the machinery for the windmill. Meanwhile, the timber was being carted away at high speed. When it was all gone, another special meeting was held in the barn for the animals to inspect Frederick's banknotes. Smiling beatifically and wearing both his decorations, Napoleon reposed on a bed of straw on the platform, with the money at his side, neatly piled on a china dish from the farmhouse kitchen. The animals filed slowly past, and each gazed his fill, and Boxer put his nose to sniff at the banknotes, and the flimsy white things stirred and rustled in his breath. 3 days later, there was a terrible hullabaloo. Hullabaloo is like the why, like a big sound, like something's going wrong. Lots of people yelling and etc. Whymper, his faith's deadly pal. Now remember, Whymper is the human who organizes all their relations with humans, the human society outside. So he's like I think he's like a lawyer or a solicitor or something. Whymper, his face deadly pale, came racing up the path on his bicycle, flung it down in the yard, and rushed straight into the farmhouse. The next moment, a choking roar of rage sounded from Napoleon's apartments. The news of what had happened sped around the farm like wildfire. The banknotes were forgeries. Frederick had got the timber for nothing. A forgery is a copy. So what Frederick has done is given Napoleon fake cash, fake money. So he's given him pieces of paper that look similar to £5 notes, but in reality are not real money issued by the government. Napoleon called the animals together immediately and in a terrible voice pronounced the death sentence upon Frederick. When captured, he said Frederick should be boiled alive. At the same time, he warned them that after this treacherous deed, the worst was to be expected. Frederick and his men might make their long-expected attack at any moment. Sentinels were placed at all the approaches to the farm, And in addition, four pigeons were sent to Foxwood, so that's Pilkington's farm, with a conciliatory message, which it was hoped might re-establish good relations with Pilkington. The very next morning the attack came. The animals were at breakfast when the lookouts came racing in with the news that Frederick and his followers had already come through the 5-barred gate. Boldly enough the animals sallied forth to meet them, but this time they did not have the easy victory that they had had in the Battle of the Cowshed. Okay, so this is an example of how important Snowball was to the animals. He really was the brains of the entire farm. And even though he made mistakes, like the windmill was, the way he designed it wasn't great, blah, 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 he still was the one who led them to victory in the Battle of the Cowshed. It was his plan of attack that allowed them to be victorious. And this mistake with the money would not have happened if Snowball had still been around. And now they're going out to attack Frederick's men, who are, better armed than the previous men were, than Jones's men were. They've got more guns, and the animals do not have a plan here. And if Snowball had been there, that would not have occurred. And I guess I don't know much about Trotsky, but I think that what Orwell's trying to say here is that Trotsky's departure from when he was expelled, when he was exiled from Russia, he had to leave Russia, or because Stalin was going to kill him, and eventually did kill him years later in Mexico where he was hiding. With the loss of Trotsky, there was a real loss of brain power, I think, in the Soviet government. The very next morning the attack came. Boldly enough the animals sallied forth to meet them, but this time they did not have the easy victory that they had had in the Battle of the Cowshed. There were 15 men with half a dozen guns between them, and they opened fire as soon as they got within 50 yards. The animals could not face the terrible explosions and the stinging pellets, and in spite of the efforts of Napoleon and Boxer to rally them, they were soon driven back. A number of them were already wounded. They took refuge in the farm building and peeped cautiously out from chinks and knotholes. The whole of the big pasture, including the windmill, was in the hands of the enemy. For the moment even Napoleon seemed at a loss. He paced up and down without a word, his tail rigid and twitching. Wistful glances were sent in the direction of Foxwood. If Pilkington and his men would help them, the day might yet be won. But at this moment the 4 pigeons who had been sent out on the day before returned, one of them bearing a scrap of paper from Pilkington. On it was penciled the words, "Serves you right." Meanwhile, Frederick and his men had halted, which I think sort of summarizes the feeling in amongst the Allies when Hitler betrayed Stalin and invaded Russia. Meanwhile, Frederick and his men had halted about the windmill. The animals watched them, and a murmur of dismay went round. 2 of the men had produced a crowbar and a sledgehammer. They were going to knock the windmill down. Now remember, the windmill symbolizes all of the infrastructure that had been built in Russia after the Russian Revolution to try and make Russia a more industrialized nation. Now the workers, the people of Russia, had to work incredibly hard to make this happen, with little return given to them for all that work, just like with the animals. And then with the invasion of Hitler's armies, a lot of that was destroyed. "Impossible," cried Napoleon. "We have built the walls far too thick for that. They could not knock it down in a week. Courage, comrades." But Benjamin was watching the movement of the men intently. The 2 with the hammer and the crowbar were drilling a hole near the base of the windmill. Slowly, and with an air almost of amusement, Benjamin nodded his long muzzle. "I thought so," he said. "Do you not see what they are doing? In another moment they are going to pack blasting powder into that hole." Terrified, the animals waited. It was impossible now to venture out of the shelter of the buildings. After a few minutes the men were seen to be running in all directions. Then there was a deafening roar. The pigeons swirled into the air, and all the animals, except Napoleon, flung themselves flat on their bellies and hid their faces. When they got up again, a huge cloud of black smoke was hanging where the windmill had been. Slowly the breeze drifted away. The windmill had ceased to exist. At this sight, the animals' courage returned to them. The fear and despair they had felt a moment earlier were drowned in their rage against this vile, contemptible act. A mighty cry for vengeance went up, and without waiting for further orders, they charged forth in a body and made straight for the enemy. This time they did not heed the cruel pellets that swept over them like hail. It was a savage, bitter battle. The men fired again and again, and when the animals got to close quarters, lashed out with their sticks and their heavy boots. A cow, 3 sheep, and 2 geese were killed, and nearly everyone was wounded. Even Napoleon, who was directing operations from the rear, had the tip of his tail chipped by a pellet. Of course, Napoleon's not actually fighting, he's just telling people what to do. But the men did not go unscathed either. 3 of them had their heads broken by blows from Boxer's hooves. Another was gored in the belly by a cow's horn. Another had his trousers nearly torn off by Jessie and Bluebell. And when the 9 dogs of Napoleon's own bodyguard, whom he had instructed to make a detour under cover of the hedge, suddenly appeared on the men's flank, baying ferociously, panic overtook them. They saw that they were in danger of being surrounded. Frederick shouted to his men to get out while the going was good, and the next moment the cowardly enemy was running for dear life. The animals chased them right down to the bottom of the field, and got in some last kicks at them as they forced their way through the thorn hedge. They had won, but they were weary and bleeding. Slowly they began to limp back towards the farm. The sight of their dead comrades stretched upon the grass moved some of them to tears, and for a little while they halted in sorrowful silence at the place where the windmill had once stood. Yes, it was gone. Almost the last trace of their labour was gone. Even the foundations were partially destroyed, and in rebuilding it they could not this time as before make use of the fallen stones. This time the stones had vanished too. The force of the explosion had flung them to distances of hundreds of yards. It was as though the windmill had never been. As they approached the farm, Squealer, who had unaccountably been absent during the fighting, came skipping towards them, whisking his tail and beaming with satisfaction. And the animals heard, from the direction of the farm buildings, the solemn booming of a gun. "What is that gun firing for?" said Boxer. "To celebrate our victory," cried Squealer. "What victory?" said Boxer. His knees were bleeding, he had lost a shoe and split his hoof, and a dozen pellets had lodged themselves in his hind leg. "What victory, comrade? Have we not driven the enemy off our soil, the sacred soil of Animal Farm? But they have destroyed the windmill, and we have worked on it for 2 years. What matter? We will build another windmill. We will build 6 windmills if we feel like it. You do not appreciate, comrade, the mighty thing that we have done. The enemy was in occupation of this very ground that we stand upon, and now, thanks to the leadership of Comrade Napoleon, we have won every inch of it back again." "Then we have won back what we had before," said Boxer. "That is our victory," said Squealer. They limped into the yard. The pellets under the skin of Boxer's legs smarted painfully. He saw ahead of him the heavy labour of rebuilding the windmill from the foundations, and already in imagination he braced himself for the task. But for the first time it occurred to him that he was 11 years old, and that perhaps his great muscles were not quite what they had once been. But when the animals saw the green flag flying, and heard the gun firing again, 7 times it was fired in all, and heard the speech that Napoleon made, congratulating them on their conduct, it seemed to them after all that they had won a great victory. The animals slain in the battle were given a solemn funeral. Boxer and Clover pulled the wagon which served as a hearse, and Napoleon himself walked at the head of the procession. 2 whole days were given over to celebration. There were songs, speeches, and more firing of the gun, and a special gift of an apple was bestowed on every animal, with 2 ounces of corn for each bird and 3 biscuits for each dog. It was announced that the battle would be called the Battle of the Windmill, and that Napoleon had created a new decoration, the Order of the Green Banner, which he had conferred upon himself. In the general rejoicings, the unfortunate affair of the banknotes was forgotten. Of course it was. It was a few days later that the pigs came upon a case of whisky in the cellars of the farmhouse. It had been overlooked at the time when the house was first occupied. Now, of course, to go back to page 15, we know that number 5, the 5th commandment of the 7, no animal shall drink alcohol, right? Let's see what happens with this whiskey. It had been overlooked at the time when the house was first occupied. That night there came from the farmhouse the sound of loud singing, in which to everyone's surprise the strains of Beasts of England were mixed up. At about 9:30, Napoleon, wearing an old bowler hat of Mr. Jones, was distinctly seen to emerge from the back door, gallop rapidly around the yard, and disappear indoors again. But in the morning a deep silence hung over the farmhouse. Not a pig appeared to be stirring. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Squealer made his appearance, walking slowly and dejectedly, his eyes dull, his tail hanging limply behind him, and with every appearance of being seriously ill. He called the animals together and told them that he had a terrible piece of news to impart. Cameron Napoleon was dying. A cry of lamentation went up. Straw was laid down outside the door of the farmhouse, and the animals walked on tiptoe. With tears in their eyes, they asked one another what they should do if their leader was taken away from them. A rumour went around that Snowball had after all contrived to introduce poison into Napoleon's food. At 11 o'clock, Squealer came to make another announcement. As his last act upon earth, Count Napoleon had pronounced a solemn decree. The drinking of alcohol was to be punished by death. By the evening, however, Napoleon appeared to be somewhat better, and the following morning Squealer was able to tell them that he was well on the way to recovery. Okay. One of the nice things about Animal Farm is there's sort of these moments of humour, satire. There's some silly jokes all the way through, and one of them is this moment here wherein all the pigs get really, really drunk, and Napoleon runs outside with this hat on and these sort of silly things that they get up to, and then if any of you have ever seen a parent or an adult that with a hangover, they always say, I'm never drinking again. Why do I do this to myself? I'm never drinking again. I'm going to die. And then, but by the evening, they're sort of starting to feel better again, and that's exactly what's happened here. So, Orwell is sort of maybe teasing us all a little bit with this image of Napoleon. By the evening of that day, Napoleon was back at work, and on the next day, it was learned that he had instructed Whymper to purchase in Willingdon some booklets on brewing and distilling. A week later, Napoleon gave orders that the small paddock beyond the orchard, which had previously been intended to set aside as a grazing ground for animals who were past work, was to be ploughed up. It was given out that the pasture was exhausted and needed reseeding, but it soon became known that Napoleon intended to sow it with barley. Okay, so not only are they drinking alcohol now, but they've asked Whymper to buy books on how to brew and distill alcohol. There's this paddock beyond the orchard, which had been decided to be a place for animals who are too old to work anymore. Once they're, too sick, and Boxer just said he's 11. He's not going to be able to work forever. So instead of them being sent, typically in farms like this, if an animal got too old, they would be sold and sent away and basically slaughtered for whatever they could be used for, their bodies could be used for. Instead of that happening, the animals got to basically go into retirement and live in this lovely pasture and just live out their days and die naturally, natural causes, as opposed to being killed by humans. So that was the promise given to the animals at the start of the revolution, but now that piece of land, that paddock, is going to be instead used for Napoleon to grow barley. Now barley is what's used to make whiskey. Okay, so now he's taking that land. Instead of letting the older animals use it, it's for him to brew alcohol. About this time there occurred a strange incident which hardly anyone was able to understand. One night at about 12 o'clock there was a loud crash in the yard, and the animals rushed out of their stalls. It was a moonlit night. At the foot of the end of the wall of the barn, the big barn where the 7 Commandments were written, there lay a ladder broken in 2 pieces. Squealer, temporarily stunned, was sprawled beside it, and near at hand there lay a lantern, a paintbrush, and an overturned pot of white paint. The dogs immediately made a ring around Squealer, and escorted him back to the farmhouse as soon as he was able to walk. None of the animals could form any idea as to what this meant, except old Benjamin, who nodded his muzzle with a knowing air and seemed to understand, but would say nothing. Okay, Benjamin's worked out the same thing that we've all worked out. Squealer has fallen off the ladder as he's trying to change one of the commandments. We know this, and the smarter animals know this. That's what's happening. But most of the animals are not really figuring that out yet. But a few days later, Muriel, reading over the 7 Commandments to herself, noticed there was yet another one of them that the animals had remembered wrong. They had thought that the 5th commandment was, "No animal shall drink alcohol," but there were 2 words that they had forgotten. Actually, the commandment read, "No animal shall drink alcohol to excess." Okay, so we begin and end this episode with commandments. With this chapter, with commandments being changed. No animal shall kill any other animal. 2 words being added without cause. No animal shall drink alcohol. 2 words being added to excess. So a really dramatic chapter where a lot's happened. We've got Boxer is injured. Seriously injured. He's getting older, and that's going to form the focus of chapter 9. What happens with Boxer is the focus of chapter 9. So I'll see you when we read that. Goodbye, Tracy. Have a good day.